In an unsurprising twist of events that absolutely no one saw coming, viewer, except anyone with a shred of common sense, Bangladesh's recent release of a dangerous anti-India terrorist, Jashimuddin Rehmani, has left certain Indian commentators in quite the pickle. These very voices were just a short while ago hailing the turmoil in Bangladesh as a noble people's revolt. You know, the kind of grassroots uprising that springs forth when a nation simply cannot tolerate another second under the thumb of a leader turned autocrat. Except, oops, now it seems that the people's revolt had a few too many people who were, shall we say, less interested in democracy and more into, well, terrorism. Let's rewind for a moment to when the unrest in Bangladesh was gaining momentum. The narrative that took hold in certain Indian media circles was almost poetic. A valiant struggle against an increasingly authoritarian leader, Sheikh Hasina, who was apparently stifling democracy with every breath she took. And we know that there were overreaches and overreactions. The opposition was cast as the last hope for a nation teetering on the brink of dictatorship. Ah, how noble, how romantic, how delightfully black and white. Because just a few months ago, these same Gyanis were mocking India and saying, by the end of this year, Bangladesh will overtake India in per capita GDP. And just months later, they were celebrating the fall of the regime that made possible this big spike in Bangladesh's per capita GDP. Never mind the inconvenient little details, like the fact that the opposition in Bangladesh includes elements who've never really been fans of democratic norms to begin with. That's just background noise when you're crafting a tale of tyranny versus freedom. Who has time for nuance? Like the fact that the interim government of Bangladesh ended the ban on the Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, its student wing Islami Chhatra Shibir, and all associated organizations that have alleged involvement in anti-India terrorism and huge anti-India political baggage that dates back to the 1971 war. But then came the plot twist that's only surprising if you've been living under a rock. Among those released in Bangladesh's supposed people's uprising was someone with a very particular set of skills. Skills that make him a nightmare for India. Yes, this freedom fighter, Jashimuddin Rehmani, turned out to be less about fighting for freedom and more about fighting for, well, extremist ideologies, murdering bloggers and starting terrorist sleeper cells in India's northeast. And in a shocking revelation, it turns out that his freedom isn't exactly a win for democracy. Who knew? Of course, this turn of events puts a bit of a dampener on the earlier enthusiastic support from our Indian commentariat. It's hard to keep championing a movement as the second coming of democracy when its stars start looking more like the villains in an action thriller, or, you know, terrorists. Now, instead of rousing speeches about the fall of a tyrant, about how India has misread the situation, we're treated to the sound of awkward silence, or worse, convoluted explanations about how this must all be some misunderstanding. After all, no one would intentionally support a movement that harbors terrorists, right? It must be that Sheikh Hasina has spun this narrative once again, like the autocratic villain she's been made out to be. Clearly, this is all part of her plan, a masterstroke to discredit the noble students' revolution. Or, and here's a radical thought, maybe the reality is a bit more complex than the simplistic tales of good versus evil that were being spun by our pseudo-liberal class here in India, which still holds great sway in the national grand conversation. Maybe, just maybe, the situation in Bangladesh isn't a one-dimensional struggle of oppressed versus oppressor. Maybe there is a dimension of outside help. Maybe there is a dimension of Western powers with vested interests in Bangladesh. Perhaps there's a lesson here about the dangers of romanticizing political movements without fully understanding the players involved. This is the reason why open and dangerous anti-India rhetoric is being passed off as the passions of a revolution where India and its support to an autocratic Sheikh Hasina are unignorable baggage inflaming a generation of Gen Z revolutionaries for whom India is enemy number one. This is the reason why dangerous falsehoods of India deliberately triggering floods in Bangladesh are amplified insidiously across social media, even here in India, and most certainly by the Western press. This is the reason why the clear persecution of minority Hindus is painted shamelessly as diversionary fake news, distracting from the passionate fires of change and the toppling of a grand villainy called Sheikh Hasina. A section of India's shameless political class, frustrated from being out of power for so long, has even openly warned that a Bangladesh-like situation could happen in India. Not for a moment have these shameless netas and ecosystems stopped to wonder about the depths they've plumbed just because they don't like who's in charge still in India. There is little doubt that India has a major challenge ahead with Bangladesh, one that's shape-shifting dangerously at India's doorstep. But will that stop India's commentariat from acknowledging that its misty-eyed swagat for Professor Muhammad Yunus as some messiah who will deliver Bangladesh from the hell of Hasina's hubris is just a tiny bit delusional and innocent? But that would require admitting that the earlier narrative was at best overly simplistic and at worst dangerously naive. And we all know that's not going to happen. After all, nothing says intellectual consistency in India like doubling down on a narrative even when it blows up in your face. So here's to the noble cause of a people's revolt. Just, watch out for the freedom fighters with terrorist ties. They're easy to miss when you're busy crafting that next great story.